All right, so let's talk about law enforcement couples. I'm going to be covering strategies for a healthy relationship and also what you need to know. So what I've done here with this training is just really compiled kind of the highlights, the best of, and the most common themes that sometimes aren't so great that we see working with law enforcement over the last few years. There are 3 of us therapists at my practice who do work with couples. None of us are specialists in that, so I do give that caveat. We do refer out to couple specialists for anybody who is okay with using insurance and wants longer term care in that way. And I can talk more about what type of couples therapy I recommend, which is the most successful. But to begin with, I'll just do a very brief intro to who we are. I know some of you are not with agencies we already work with, so just to give you a little bit of familiarity, these are kind of our main pieces as far as our mission goes. We would just like to connect everybody in law enforcement in Minnesota to someone who knows how to help. So we all, as you know, just regular people out there, have a number we can call if we ever really need something. That's of course 911. You all are on the other side of that line, and so I really believe you all should have numbers you can call too and know that you can get the kind of help that you need. So we are occupationally competent care. We work only with first responders and mostly law enforcement. We of course want to help mitigate the common stress response for first responders. We recognize how mentally strong and resilient you already are, and we want to enhance that. And we really operate from a place of just knowing that what affects you is very commonly a stress response or a symptom of stress. And a lot of times that can permeate, and often does, into relationships at home and in your personal life. So that is the reason for this training today. We are, of course, very passionate about suicide prevention as well, and we take it very seriously to be able to build trust and relationships with folks so they can be honest with us about how we're doing so that we can help. We can only help to the extent that someone feels they can be honest with us. And so we work hard at that in the way that we do our business. These are the 5 other therapists who work with me. There's 6 of us in total. We have 2 offices. And we work with just about 50 agencies in Minnesota right now. So I'm going to be chatting today specifically about families, law enforcement families, support. And the reason for that is because it is such an incredibly important piece of resilience for both of you. Hopefully you are here with your significant other, listening in together. If you don't already, please make sure to each have something you can write on and write with. So a pad of paper and a pen would be perfect. Just a piece of scratch paper or printer paper, any of that's fine, whatever is nearby, because there'll be a number of times where I stop. I will put things on pause and set a timer, and I'll give you some specific pieces to reflect on. I'll be giving you a lot of information, and then I'm going to be asking you to do quite a bit of self-reflection and then sharing with your significant other what your thoughts are that you came up with. So there are, of course, unique stressors in law enforcement. The last couple of years in particular have been, of course, just outrageously stressful for multiple reasons. And we're going to talk about the dynamic at home that's so common and why it happens that way. And we're also going to talk about just generally what are the common themes and dynamics in couples. I will speak a lot to John Gottman's work, and I'll tell you more about who he is. He's probably a bigger nerd than I am, which I always find fun to learn from. And so he specializes in couples and has a lot of wisdom to share. Sue Johnson is the other one who is a big source of the information I'll share with you. And she is the founder of Emotionally Focused Therapy for Couples, which is the type of couples therapy that I would recommend if that's anything that you and your partner are interested in. So EFT for couples. So we're going to talk today about the effect of stress on the brain, the body, and then the personal life for officers, and that incredible ability that's necessary to be able to switch in and out of this work mode. We'll go into detail on that. And then, like I said, we're going to talk about dynamics and strategy. So I want to first, though, explain a little bit about just how important support is for us. Interestingly, couples who divorce, and the divorce rate is above 50% in the general population, fewer than 10% of those couples who divorce ever talked to a therapist. And at the same time, that specific type of therapy, EFT for couples, has about a 70% quote unquote success rate as far as helping couples reconnect and heal, or build connection, whatever it might be. So that's a pretty staggering discrepancy there. And so part of why I want to give you all this information, just sort of hand it to you in these 2 hours, is because it is such a foundational piece that we spend a lot of time covering and uncovering for couples and helping them to discover as we work with them over the weeks that we get to see them. And so I would love to give you just a head start on a lot of this. I've boiled it all down to what you'll see here. The reason it's so important, feeling supported and connected, really having a secure attachment, which means that you really know you can count on your partner when things get difficult. The reason that's so important is that we are so built for this connection that the feeling of loneliness is actually equivalent to smoking about 15 cigarettes per day. So on our physical health, loneliness is toxic for us. When you have strong connected relationships, they lead to everything that I listed here. So greater longevity, stronger immune system, greater wealth, health, resilience, your children are more successful, all of these things. So this, some of the most interesting research about connectedness and secure attachments was done by a study through Harvard University. And it's one of the longest studies that's ever gone on in the history of humans. So far, it's been going on for over 75 years. And they tracked about 725 men who, about half of them were Harvard graduates who then went off to fight in World War II. And then the other half were from the poorest neighborhood in Boston. And so as the decades went on, they continually tracked these folks and checked back in with them. And what they were studying is what makes life good and healthy and happy. And what they found out is that the absolute best way that you can invest your time and energy into your future self to set you up for health and happiness is to invest in close relationships. So it's not money, it's not fame, it's not that promotion that's the best investment for you. It's your close relationships. And so those secure attachments where you know you can count on the other person and they know they can count on you is really what brings the most happiness. So money, yes, to a certain point, we need sort of a basic amount of money, which a few years back was around $80,000 a year for a family of 4. And then beyond that, there's no additional happiness that's brought to the family once there's basic needs met plus a little bit of fun money. Actually, people are hurt by fame. And so, and then, promotions may be good, or they may sort of increase a cycle of overworking, which can harm your health and your relationships. So it all came down to those secure attachments. So that is what we're focused on today. I'm excited to be able to do this. This has been in the works for quite some time as I've been developing it. So thank you for being here and for your attention. So co-regulation is an effective way to counteract the intensity of work life. As I mentioned, it's a really important resilience factor. And when you can tune into each other, you can can get oxytocin in your system, which is a chemical. It's otherwise known as the cuddle hormone or the love hormone, and it can help counteract adrenaline. So I'll explain how detrimental being chronically stressed is, and how this closeness with your family and your significant other can counteract that. You can have better life balance when you have close ties with your family. You can have a sense of feeling understood and supported no matter what is happening at work or out there in the world. If you are tuned into your significant other at home as the officer and can kind of see the world through their eyes, it can preserve and protect a sense of normalcy. Your ability to see the world through those who don't have the burden of knowing what you do about, some of the worst of humanity. And then you can have a shared vision for a future that you're both working towards. So these are some of the things that I hope for you. So I listed here for you many of the most common couples issues that we see. So I just kind of here, this is what tends to come up most often. And there's a scenario we may have time for at the end, which I'll just mention here as well, where sometimes an officer comes in, usually it's a male officer, and he sits down and says, well, I'm here because my wife or significant other says I was being a jerk, or I am being a jerk. So that's a really common one as well, but we are often working just with an individual, not with a couple. And so these, though, are specific to couples. So not feeling like there's enough physical affection. One person in the couple may feel like nothing they do is enough. Feeling like they are maybe left to the last on the list of priorities is another one. Feeling like they are not listened to. Often this is a female in a partnership, but of course we work with all different, people with all different sexuality, and so none of this is specific to any particular gender or whatnot, but just generally I'll tell you how this tends to play out. And then some will say he or she changed and I don't know what happened. That's usually a female saying that about a male officer. And then ultimately what I think a lot of this boils down to is a question of, I'm not sure how much this person loves me because they changed, because they're not listening, or I'm not feeling heard, or because I don't feel like the priority I used to be, or because I'm trying but nothing seems to land right, or I'm not getting what I need to feel loved as far as affection or anything else. So I just thought I would start off there with the most common issues. If these are anything that you are or have experienced, they're common. So I wanted to point that out. Certainly not alone there. I also wanted to speak to two cop couples. I don't know if we have any on today, but I wanted to be sure to mention this because it's a dynamic of its own. And when I have presented this training in the past, I asked the audience, full of many officers, what are the pros and cons? And this is what they came up with. And a couple that I added from the research I've done and the experiences I've had with two cop couples. So pros are over here. You can, of course, easily relate to each other. You understand the physical and mental challenges of the work. You can be very solid and reliable for each other. And you could also motivate each other in a healthy, positive way with some lighthearted competition and others. On the con side, sometimes and often cops can have pretty alpha personalities. You have to be able to have that command presence, and those personalities can clash. I've heard that it can be either really great or a disaster, and not often a ton in between. That's of course not always the case, but just generally I'm speaking to this. You could also use that competitiveness in a negative way. You can have opposing or conflicting schedules where you end up just sort of passing each other at certain times and not having much togetherness. Childcare can be really difficult. And because of that, sometimes only one cop in the couple can really promote, even if maybe you both had a preference for that and maybe even both pursued education. It's possible that really only one can promote, and that's an incredible sacrifice to make for your partner. And then it can be harder to have a balanced life. It can be that too often you sort of talk shop because you have so much familiarity with it, but not always, of course. So it can really go either way. But either way, I hope that the info I give you here can certainly help. So I want to talk about stress. So stress is actually at its baseline a good thing. We need some levels of stress to be healthy. Stress is why we get out of bed in the morning. We have a sense of adrenaline and purpose, and a little bit of a challenge motivates us. We have something that we're working towards in life. And so we actually wouldn't be healthy if we didn't have any stress at all. We purposely work out our bodies physically to create a little bit of stress, which ends up making us healthier. And so we're really built for stress, and especially for temporary stressors, even pretty intense temporary stressors, we tend to be built for, and especially cops are. But too much stress for too long is what's toxic. And so too much stress for too long hurts every single part of your body and brain from head to toe. So there's a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and nerdy people like me read such books. Robert Sapolsky is the author, and the title is Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, because he's comparing zebras, who are also mammals, to humans. We both have a stress response system. We both have, threatening events, life or death scenarios, and especially law enforcement have this factor at play much more often than the general population. But why do zebras get away with the way they are in these life or death scenarios and not have things like ulcers, cardiovascular disease, lowered immune systems, dementia, PTSD? Why isn't that a problem for zebras? And there's a couple things about it. One of the main ones is that when a zebra is under stress, for instance, being chased by a lion, the zebra is doing what? It's running, right? So it's actually exercising well under stress. And so it is getting an incredible amount of stress relief, even while it's running. So by the time it outruns the lion and lives to tell you about it, it has likely cleared out a lot of those stress chemicals. After the stressor has passed, a zebra will then lap up some water, do a full body shake like a dog does to help clear out the rest of that adrenaline rush, and then probably take a nap in the shade. So on the other hand, that's not what cops get to do. A lot of times you're in scenarios for short or long periods of time that are highly stressful, but you don't always or ever get to go for a run, burn off those stress chemicals, take a big drink of water, and lay down for a nap between calls. You just have to go do the next thing. You're constantly having to override your nervous system and just take care of the next thing, stay on high alert. And so this other difference between zebras and humans is that in between periods of stress and intensity, a zebra isn't worried about the next period of stress. So zebras have to worry about being injured because then they can't run or get the food they need. they need to worry about predators, and they need to worry about starvation, and that's it. So in addition to police work and the hypervigilance that it requires when you're on the job, there's also the rest of life and the things that our human brains worry about. And if you look at your phone and read the news, you probably have a huge number of very unhelpful stimulus coming into your brain on top of everything else that can be adding on to that stress too. So side note, if you can turn off all those notifications, it's good for you. So I'm going to explain a little more here about the brain science of stress and trauma, because this really is just the foundational piece for understanding why specifically is there a unique type of strain on law enforcement families. You know, if the general population has a divorce rate of above 50%, it's I think somewhere around 54, 56%. Law enforcement, I see different numbers. It maybe is around that, or I've seen as high as 70-some%. I've had people in this training guess that it's 99%, which isn't true. But my question is, even if it is about average with the general population, why is that? Law enforcement are exceptionally mentally strong. You do an evaluation, you have a psych eval done, you're definitely more resilient than the general population. We see it as therapists who work solely with first responders and especially law enforcement that, like I said, we're not really almost ever dealing with actual mental illness. It's just the strains and the sometimes injury of stress. And so why is that divorce rate, even if it is just the same as the general population, why is that? It should be much lower, right? And so I think that the reason is because of the stress of the job and because the information that you all need to have healthy, successful, connected, secure relationships just hasn't been out there and available enough. So I'm really hoping that this can help. All right, so back to the brain. So the brain is the command center of our entire body. It's always managing resources, and I'm talking about glucose, water, salts, you name it, all of these chemicals and hormones and such that we have in our body and that we are always needing to replenish and refuel with the water and the nutrition that we take in. And the sunlight and everything else that we need to do to take care of ourselves, which I will talk about in a minute here. So our brain is always managing resources, and it's always doing that most efficiently by predicting. It's trying to predict what's going to happen next so that it knows how to be ready for it. Because the best thing, of course, is to be prepared, right? So our brain gathers information through our senses of sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. And this is how the brain gathers information. And then this is how the brain predicts what is likely to happen next. And so you can imagine that for an officer who, in the just course of police work will encounter many potentially life or death and safety related scenarios, even within a day's work, sometimes depending on how busy the area is that you work in, you can imagine that law enforcement brain is going to predict much more often that more of that is going to happen. I apologize, one of my dogs is barking in the background, so I asked my daughter to try to help with it. I hope it's not too disturbing. So you can imagine that the average person in a lifetime experiences a handful of potentially traumatic events where it's terrifying, there's life or death circumstances involved, it's horrific, something like that. It's an average of like 2 to 4 maybe, but for law enforcement, there is potentially traumatic events sometimes every day, week, month, and certainly numerous of them, even hundreds of them in a career. And so the brain of a law enforcement officer is going to predict more of that's going to happen. You have to be ready when it does happen. You don't get the luxury of, switching into gear. So you have to be chronically hypervigilant, essentially, at work to have really strong officer safety. Because the brain is entirely oriented around survival, it's going to prioritize this. So for efficiency, the brain is going to predict more of this and just stay hypervigilant, because ultimately that's going to be less expensive to it, right? So if the brain is always experiencing so much safety related issues, in order to be prepared, it's going to just tend to stay hypervigilant. And so this is important to know, of course, because this makes it exceptionally difficult to switch out of that stress mode, which I'll talk more about doing, because it is critical to having healthy relationships. It's also critical that your partner understands this dynamic and just how challenging it is and how much attention needs to be paid to it, really, by both of you, and support each other in this. A degree of this also can be happening for your partner, unless they are also in law enforcement or in the first responder field, which lands somewhere in that range, not as extreme as it is for law enforcement, but with the dangers, but to some degree certainly it could also be there. And so that's worth recognizing for yourself too, for each of you. So every human has this stress response system. Every mammal actually has it. And when we experience stress, we will always display that in a fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so when that information hits our brain through our senses, it hits our brain all at the same time, but the stress response system, the threat detection system, will respond the fastest. You don't have to think about how to respond, you just will. And so for law enforcement, you have to respond with fight mode. This doesn't mean necessarily throwing punches. It means being able to take action, move toward a danger or a threat, and be able to function well under small and very large amounts of stress based on your training. So for law enforcement, for survival, you have to switch into fight mode when under stress. Now, any of the rest of us may tend to have flight, like you want to escape the stressor, or freeze mode, where you just sort of shut down, or maybe fight mode. It may depend on the scenario, but that, if you are able to recognize your stress response system kicking in and then have a say over your fight, flight, or freeze mode, this is part of that agility that you need. So it's an incredible thing to be able to do, because your thinking brain is having to come into play here. You have to practice this ability to train yourself to recognize when you're starting to feel stressed enough that this system is kicking into gear, and then be careful and have a measured response when you need to. And so that's part of this dynamic that I'm explaining here. So a stress response system is going to initiate a rapid heart rate, sweating, heightened senses. Your breathing is going to be more rapid and also more shallow. And your pupils will dilate. You may get tunnel vision. You may have an auditory exclusion where you won't have a memory of sounds as well as you normally would, things like that. So you can imagine our poor human brains can go from legitimate life or death safety scenarios that get this stress response system going to something as minor as, the relatively minor as the chaos of home life with small children. And our brain will take in that sensory input and give a very similar stress response, which is really can be very unnerving for the person experiencing it, and also distressing for the partner who doesn't know why their person might be overreacting or underreacting, or not very well able to kind of manage that chaos. At work, that kind of chaos can be deadly. But at home, it's just normal part of the flow. But you can imagine how bringing this stress, this stressed fight mode potential and chronic hypervigilance home with you can lead to some of what we'll talk about. So these are the trauma exposures that are so common to law enforcement. And I like to say here, just quickly, I have run into a lot of couples who don't have really solid language for talking to each other a lot of time about these things. And not that I want you to be sharing these things. Maybe you do, and that works for you. Maybe you don't, and that's better for you. I don't necessarily have a say on that. I just want to be sure that you have some language around what kind of day you've each had, where your capacity is at. If you have replays happening of some difficult things you experienced, whatever that may be, because I often hear that an officer wants to leave work at work or doesn't want to, wants to allow their partner to stay naive, not have to know some of the gory details of these disturbing things. But just make sure you're not then also shorting your relationship on the communication that's important to have, because your partner at home can still feel that you're struggling or stressed, but may not know why, and then might take it personally or just feel left out or left in the dark. So that's something to make a note to at some point here when you have a follow-up conversation. Make sure to speak about if you don't already have a good way of handling that. So stress accumulation, if you work with us, you already know we talk about this metaphor of a container, kind of like on day one of, this job or life, whatever it is, the container was essentially empty. And then where is it today? So where has this stacked up to? Often what you experience through your sleep cycles, your exercise, your nutrition, your hydration, your supports, having a balanced life, the attitude you have towards stress, a lot of it just kind of passes through you. It comes and it goes. You may acknowledge the way that something felt for you, and when you do, that helps it move through you faster. Or you may have experienced things that overwhelmed your system, or you weren't able to sleep well and it kind of compounded, or you tend to just pack things away. You don't want to feel your feelings, or something was too overwhelming to your system, or there's just a big old stack of, sometimes I call it paper cuts, just lots and lots of the stuff that you have to see and do on a daily basis in your job that sort of wears at you, or kind of that ambient noise stress. Any of that is what can start to fill this container. So to be really aware of this phenomenon is important, because the more that container fills up, the less capacity you have for whatever stressors are ahead. And we all know very well that there is always more ahead. It's just the ups and downs of life. And so having as much capacity as you can for whatever may be ahead is going to, of course, be the healthiest for you, and then also be the healthiest for your relationship. Because the higher that this container fills, the less emotional regulation you're likely to have. And the most successful couples tend to physiologically be very calm, and then much able to connect and to regulate each other. So let's take just a second here. I'm going to set a timer and give you a few minutes. I want you to you should have your own piece of paper and pen. And first, without sharing, just do some self-reflection. So number one is, how full is your container? Actually draw a picture of a container and think about how much stress for you has stacked up recently. So just at this moment, and it may include, really anything that feels like it's sitting there as a stressor for you is what should be taking up some space in that container. Maybe there's just a smidge in the bottom, or maybe your container is full and overflowing. Just be really honest with yourself about that. You're not sharing this with anybody except your person who you're sitting next to there. And then I want you to make a list. So actually list out what is in that container. Do you have chronic pain? Are there any medical issues going on? Do you have an aging parent who's struggling? Do you have work scenarios that play for you in your mind? Do you get nightmares? Are you having relationship strain? Have you had a major loss? Any of these things. It can even go back as far as childhood, family stuff that gets stirred up. Nothing is off limits here. If it is a stressor for you that you carry around as any kind of weight, then it should be on that list. And then I want you to next, and normally I tell people to stay in their own lane and be accountable to their own stuff, but I do want you to draw a picture of your significant other's container, and I want you to fill in how full you think that their container seems. So you're not deciding for them how full their container is. This is just your impression of how you feel that theirs is full. And the reason I'm having you step outside your own lane there is because we often will notice stress in each other before we notice in ourselves. So please do that. Of course, it's with all the best of intentions because you likely have a very good read on your partner and can give each other some insight on this. So that would be the last piece. Whatever you come up with for these 3 pieces, please share those responses with each other once you've both completed them on your own. And then we will come back together. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes for this. And I will set a timer here. So if you haven't already gotten started while I was explaining the instructions, please do go ahead and get started right now. And I will give you a heads up when we've got 2 minutes left. We are right at about 2 minutes left. So if you are still working on your list, maybe just put to be determined with the rest of your list, and you can circle back to that later and move on to number 3 or start sharing the responses. All right, we're wrapping that up now. Certainly start if you haven't completed your conversation there. I want you to come back to it. At the end here, I'll give you a moment to talk about some follow-up conversation to be good to do. If you have kids, it can be hard. You need to literally schedule this stuff in. So that could be really valuable for you. Also, I'll give the disclaimer that I'm not your couples therapist. And so I'm just providing you with some information and strategies and conversation starters. But if either one of you would like to work with a couples therapist, please do. I've had enough people say that their partner asked them if they would go to couples therapy, they didn't, and then they regret not going later on. And so please keep that in mind, and I can speak more to how to do that later. All right, so I hope that you learned something from this about yourself and or about your partner. And this conversation, I think, is one that can be continued, certainly, and can be an ongoing one. So one of the things we do when we provide our annual mental health check-ins with first responders is we talk about this container metaphor, what's in there for you, how high has your stack gotten? Is it starting to overflow? Are you noticing stress symptoms? How is this playing out for you? Is anybody else noticing these symptoms in you? And so really being open to getting that feedback, which can be expressed and delivered in a really kind, thoughtful way to each other is going to help you be much better off. So these are some of the symptoms of that cup being full. It may show up in your mood, your irritability. It may show up in your sleep. You might feel overwhelmed if things seem out of control. You might be relying too much on alcohol. You may have physical pains or aches. You also might not feel much at all. And actually a lack of emotion is a stress symptom too. So you may have some numbness. And so, like I said, it's usually easier for others to see these things in us than it is for us to notice them in ourselves, especially when you work in a profession where you are constantly having to just do the next thing and not tune in. You're very trained to tune out. So you can have some blind spots. And if you can really listen to your partner who can cue you as to what they notice is happening for you and trust them and take that, deliver it in a kind way and don't take it in a defensive way, that's going to be a super big benefit for both of you, and be able to do that both ways too. So these are some of the challenges for a law enforcement family. I won't list off all of them. You can see them here. And if you are the spouse of a law enforcement officer, it would be good if you could take a note here of which ones of these are hardest for you, because it matters. You being a law enforcement family is like being a military family. There is really a team approach that's needed, because you are in this together. It may not have been the profession you chose, but as a family, you're in it. And they need your support, and you need their understanding, and their understanding of the sacrifices that you make, and all of these things. So it's good to be aware of these things, not, of course, because of some sort of scorekeeping approach. That's not healthy, but more so because having a give and take that's well balanced is the goal here. So the plus is that you have shared experiences and your life is enriched by each other. And so in every scenario, there's a give and take. And let's just be very honest about the one that is unique to your family. All right, so we'll talk more about this emotional agility piece here before we take a break. There is 3 areas of operation for law enforcement. There's street mode, there's within the 4 walls of your agency, which is a different mode, and then there's home mode, which is an even different mode. And so these 3 fall on, essentially street mode is on one end of a spectrum. The mode inside your agency is somewhere in the middle, and then your home mode is the other entirely opposite end of that same spectrum. And so I like to point out how incredible this is to move between in such a short amount of time. There is no other job like it. And I think that this is the ultimate challenge of police work, is to not only be able to operate in street mode for such a long time in a career, which is sort of like sprinting a marathon, but also to be able to downshift, down regulate, and switch out of that mode and into home mode, where you can be very effective there. But it takes a whole different sort of approach to how you operate. So we'll talk about that here. This is street mode. It's about safety and survival. It requires that hypervigilance, of course. And then it's also where you need to be ready for anything. One step ahead, you need to be thinking ahead into the future, which is a certain sort of lane in your brain that you need to stay in. You need to have the ability to have a command presence, to make some sort of order out of chaos, and problem solve, come to resolutions quickly. You're a fixer in this role. You need to be efficient, and you've got probably another call or 2 waiting for you. So you need to get to the bottom of things as quick as you can. There's also the chemical dopamine involved. So dopamine is all about motivation and anticipation. It's what gives you energy and kind of that drive feeling. And it's what allows us to look forward to things. And even if that exciting call never comes through, it's still the chance that it might that gives us the dopamine, and is what keeps you going. And then some people are very highly wired towards dopamine, others not so much. And I'll talk about how sometimes, like people who are wired in a very similar way couple up, and sometimes opposites but equals tend to couple up, and the challenges that can cause. And then the other thing about street mode is that it can be a calling. It can give you your sense of purpose, and one that's hard to match. You can also get a feeling of satisfaction when you're effective at doing a job that few can do. And so these are really important, and something to make note of. Interestingly, though, on the other end of the spectrum is home mode. And so, on the other hand, you need to be very flexible and able to go with the flow. There might be a lot of energy that's needed, but in a different way, in like this kind of able to roll with it way, because kids and family life is just inherently kind of chaotic. And so, to be able to have flexibility with that is what your family needs from you, and is what you need to be able to connect with your family really well. You've got to be able to tune into them emotionally, versus at work. A healthy level of detachment is good for you. You can't be feeling with everyone you're assisting who's suffering, or you would just, um, it would be devastating to a person. But at home, you've got to be able to tune in, and listen so that you can understand, not try to fix things, but really make sure you have a strong reciprocal relationship, a give and take, lots of respect both ways, which is sometimes very different from what you experience at work. And then you, in home mode, are ideally feeling content. So you have a routine that's predictable, that's really healthy for your brain to have these routines and a sense of purpose, which is really focused at home on the long game, right? It's this marathon, but you can't sprint this marathon. It's about the process, not the outcome. And it takes vulnerability, right? So you need to have your guard down emotionally. You're being vulnerable with your heart here, versus at work, you're being vulnerable with your life. And so it's both vulnerability in very extreme senses, but at home, it's with your heart. And so you know how to be vulnerable because you do it at work. And so applying that same level of vulnerability, but at home, is the key there. So I mentioned how important the resilience factors are for us. These are the 6 resilience factors. Support is right in the middle there, and feeling connected at home is one of them. I'm going to talk through these resilience factors specific to couples when we come back from a break. But I want to give you just a 5-minute break. And so let's come back at 8:05 and we will get started. If you have any questions during our break, please send them to me through chat, or the number that I gave you that you can text to, and grab a drink of water, stretch, move around, continue conversation, whatever you want to do. I'll see you in 5 minutes. All right, we'll get started in just one more minute. All right, so let's start to come back and we'll pick back up and we'll really get into some of the meat of the presentation here in our last section. So we've talked about that stress dynamic, shifting between these different modes. If you are an investigator, or you have to bring your work home with you, if you're a canine officer, if you're an administrator, a lot of times it's much more difficult to switch out of work mode because you are continually having to be kind of on in some of those cases. And so it can be exceptionally more difficult to really truly be tuned in at home and in home mode instead of letting that overlap happen. So it's a really incredible thing to be able to switch between those three modes. And when you're unable to, it's a matter of really working on and practicing your emotional agility. It's actually your nervous system that needs the practice that most people don't have trouble dialing up the intensity, most have trouble dialing back. And so exercise, having your sleep and your recovery, if you use tactical breathing, a double inhale where you inhale and then take another little sip of air and then fully exhale, a few of those can really downshift your nervous system for you. They replicate a sigh of relief. Music, you can use mindfulness, any of these techniques, stretching, any of this, yoga, whatever, to help switch into a more relaxed mode is really helpful. You can use exercise for that. If you are more stressed than you wanted to be and you're sleeping well, but you're not exercising, there's a really important card you're not playing. And if you add in exercise, 150 minutes a week is what everybody needs, but any amount that you add in is going to help you. And this is really one of those things where it's a matter of mood follows action. So if you don't feel like exercising, that's not the point. The point is that if you just set yourself up so that you're going to go do it, maybe you do it first thing when you wake up, you set your alarm for the right time, you lay out your clothes and your shoes, and you have everything set up so that it's going to happen. It's not a decision you have to make. You're then most likely to follow through with it. And then as a consequence, you'll feel better for having done it. And that's how there can be like a positive snowball effect with that. So if you take the action of doing the exercise, your mood will follow instead of waiting until you feel like doing it, because that just may never happen. So if you're already prioritizing sleep and non-sleep, deep rest, or that breath work, or using whatever tactics you use to kind of down regulate your system, but you're still stressed and you're not exercising, add that in. That's going to be your best go-to. It's a close second to sleep for how much you need it and how much it will help you shift out of that chronic hypervigilant mode that's so toxic to you to stay in outside of work. So these are all the pieces that play into resilience and help boost your agility to switch between these modes, to process stress, all of that stuff. Having a balanced life. What do you do for fun? Do the two of you have something you do as a couple for fun that connects you or is active? Or, you know, some of it is maybe what one person prefers, some of it maybe you both prefer, some might be something the other of the couple prefers. But as long as you're just still engaging in these things and helping keep your life balanced, that's really important. If you have kids, it can be especially hard. You have to actually schedule these things in. I get it if spontaneity is more fun, but it's just not always possible. And it's more important that you have the time. And so planning for it, prioritizing that will ultimately be the best thing for your kids too. And so if you don't have family who can help, you can try finding a sitter if you don't have one, or you don't have a family friend who can be one for you. Care.com is an option to find a sitter. Sometimes that's one of the main things we need to work on right away when we work with couples, is you've got to have some time cut out for you. And I know it's like said all the time, but are you actually doing it? And if you're not, put that on your to-do list. You don't want to become roommates, and you want to be able to stay tuned into each other and know what's happening in each other's lives, and be a source of relaxation and not stress for each other. Your mindset, this is your attitude. It's about being really acutely aware of what you can and can't control. And so if you tend to worry a lot about different things, you can make a list of everything you worry about. And if any of the things you're worrying about you have no control over, you can cross those things out. And then the things you can do something about, you can list possible solutions or steps you can take. And then you kind of have an action plan for yourself. And this can help you feel energized and empowered to do what you can, and try not to spend energy and time that you won't ever get back on things that you can't control. So that's something you could do together or individually. And then professional care. So this would be access to appropriate care and willingness to access it. And so I mentioned emotionally focused therapy for couples is a great option. You can find someone who's trained in that method. You can reach out to us and either get from us a list of therapists who specialize in couples therapy, who we refer officers to and have heard good feedback. And the other option is, if you have a program with us already, if the agency you work for does, you can see us for couples therapy with the sessions that you have allotted. So Nicole and Carly and I do some couples therapy. All right, so what ways can you as a couple really prioritize these 6 things? And the professional care is accessing it as needed. It isn't something everybody needs all the time. It's normal to need it at different phases in your relationship and in your life and in your career in law enforcement. And to just know that you'll utilize it as needed, kind of like you should go to the doctor every year and get your checkup or get your oil changed in your car. It's the same exact thing. You don't want to wait until it's crisis mode, but even if it is, better late than never, still reach out. And there absolutely is help and options. So what can you as a couple do in these 6 areas to really strengthen these for yourselves and for each other? Can you team up on any of them? Can you partner to support each other in any of these in any better way than you already are? So maybe store that as a continued conversation to be having. So we're next going to talk about some of these common dynamics. So John Gottman, I mentioned, is the researcher. He's a couples specialist, and he has studied couples for a really long time. And so he has actually a laboratory at a university, and he's learned so much about couples from observing them and interviewing them. And he knows couples and the dynamics so well that he can listen to a couple argue for about 3 minutes, and with 96% accuracy, he can predict if they're going to divorce. And I will tell you what he listens for when he does that. But first, I want to talk about bids. A bid is essentially an offer for connection. I want to talk about how important these are and how to listen for them and respond to them. And then I'll explain to you about emotional equals coupling up and how you tend to be opposite. For sure, under pressure and stress, you can tend to be opposite. As a couple, I'll explain that dynamic. You might see yourself in that. And then I'll also tell you about the 4 horsemen, which are the 4 indicators of divorce and 4 common communication sort of missteps that are made, and then what to do about them, how to recognize them in yourself and what to do about them. So Dr. Gottman had this love lab, and he and another researcher gave 40,000 couples these questionnaires. They followed them for 2 decades, and they also measured physiological signs that they were having during conversations with their partners. And so they were measuring the emotional perception of the interaction. And these studies were so accurate that they replicated the outcome 6 different times. And so, of course, that's one of the measures of a really solid study, is that it's replicable. And so I love being able to give you this information. So he talks about how your relationship, and every relationship you have, but specifically the one with you and your partner who's sitting next to you, it has a bank account. And so between the two of you, you have this piggy bank, let's say, and everything you ever do is either going to be a deposit or a withdrawal from that account. And so I want you to think about these deposits and withdrawals in terms of bids. And so let's say that you attempt to connect with your partner. You're essentially trying to make a deposit into your account, right? You invite them to watch a movie with you and cuddle after the kids go to bed, right? That is a bid. And if your partner responds to it and is like, yeah, thanks, that's I love that you invited me to do that, and let's do it, then they've accepted the bid and you have put like a large deposit in your account, right? But if one of you makes that request or offers that bid and the other one doesn't notice it or rejects it, that could end up being a withdrawal from your account. So these bids are really important because they end up telling your partner that you're interested in them, you understand them, you're on their side, you're holding space for them, you want to help them, you want to be with them, and you accept them, and you hear them. So whenever you can start to recognize these bids and then respond to them, you're going to be telling them all of these things essentially. So that's why it's so important, is there's so much meaning in these. And it can be as something as simple as you're walking down the street and your partner says, look at that sports car, that's exactly the one I've been looking at and dreaming about, and you either dismiss it or you make kind of a snide remark or you criticize something about it, or you respond to it and you show interest in it, even if you don't care at all about sports cars or you have a frustration related to this topic. If you respond positively, you're now turning toward your partner's bid and telling them, I'm interested in you, I care about you. So that's like just a small example, but these happen all the time, all day long. And so starting to understand that what your partner is doing with a lot of their behavior and words towards you is a bid can start to sort of transform how you interact, and certainly shore up how you behave together as far as your connectedness. So these are the 3 ways that you can turn away from a bid. You can either be preoccupied, maybe you're not giving them your full attention. You might disregard the bid. You could interrupt the whole process, and any of these aren't going to feel good. So some of them, these are likely not happening on purpose, but are still hurtful, and it's missed opportunities. So listening for bids, these are some examples of, minor ones, asking for help with something, really wanting your full attention, laughing at a joke, that's even a positive response to a bid versus, an eye roll or whatever. Looking to your partner to help you calm down or to help them calm down, being affectionate, sharing the events of your day. Any of these things are these offers for connection. And so to listen for them, to provide them, to respond to them is the key here. The happiest couples respond to 86% of each other's bids. It's essentially the It's essentially like the people who have essentially mastered their connection with their partner have this high of a level of response to bids. And so it's the most important aspect of your relationship on like the positive side. So the example here would be if your partner says, I'm so frustrated with this situation at work or this colleague, and if you're gonna like turn towards them, listen to that, ask them clarifying questions, you're gonna be making a deposit, right? If you jump to trying to fix the issue and get to the core of it and, maybe be in work mode and be ready for the next thing to tackle, the next challenge that comes up, you might accidentally be making a withdrawal from that relationship bank account. So the other thing to keep in mind is you always want to give your partner the benefit of the doubt whenever, especially if tensions are high. So you want to, anytime you possibly can, do that and notice if you aren't and notice if there's a reason you're not. Sometimes you are running at a zero or even a negative balance in that bank account. And something to think about there is if there is a repair that might need to be made so that deposits can stick. I've had plenty of clients say, I feel like I'm trying to make deposits, but I'm not successful. And sometimes that's because there's a hurt that hasn't been properly healed and some repair is needed so that what you're doing can stick instead of just sort of falling through to the bottom. So let's take 5 minutes here and we're gonna, again, same thing first, just self-reflect on your own. What kind of bids do you tend to give to your partner? In what ways do you look to sort of reach out to them? The second thing to make note of is what do you notice your partner giving to you as far as bids? There may be bids that you're not even noticing that they're giving, but you'll find out in a minute here. But what are you noticing? And then how good are you at noticing and responding to your partner's bids? And give yourself like a 0 to 10 scale rating here. Like 10 is I'm perfect at it. I never miss a single one, 100%. 8 is 80% of the time. 2 is 20% of the time. 0 is I'm terrible at it. I never do it. And I can't believe he or she puts up with me. So be honest about it. Do that on your own, those first 3, and then share your responses with each other. And I will make a timer and I'll let you know when there's 2 minutes left of our 5 minutes. We have about 2 minutes left, just so you know. All right, so we'll come back together here in just a minute. If you can wrap up your conversation, and again, star that piece for later if you can follow up and come back to this. All right, so we're going to continue on here with talking about these common dynamics. We've talked about bids. Next, we're going to talk about the way that emotional equals but opposites tend to couple up. So there are a few different attachment types, and I'm going to explain to you a really common dynamic that I see when I'm working with couples. So if you want to learn more about this in more detail, there's a book called Attached, and it's really good. It's all kind of the latest on how to understand your attachment style, how to determine what it is, and how to understand your partner if they have a different one from yours. But even securely attached couples under pressure will tend to fall on one side or the other here. So a securely attached person or couple will just really feel solid about themselves and about their partner and know that that person is there for them when things get tough, and just feel that sort of reliability and security feeling. Somebody who tends to be more anxious is a little more reactive, will notice if something isn't feeling secure or just right, and will often feel that and speak up about it, or express that in some way. And then someone who's on the avoidant side will tend to be a little more reserved emotionally, be less reactive, and often similarly anxious, but in a more avoidant and reserved way. And so that's how that tends to play out. People who tend to be more anxious will often couple up with someone who is equally avoidant. So you end up being emotional equals, but essentially in opposite ways. And the reason for that is two anxious people don't couple up because you would just frustrate each other. And then two avoidant people don't often couple up because you would just avoid each other. Wouldn't get very far. So certainly anxious people will couple up with someone who's pretty secure and they can handle that anxiety, or someone pretty avoidant might couple up with someone who is secure because the secure person isn't bothered by that reserved tendency or avoidant tendency. But either way, under pressure, a lot of times people will find themselves in this kind of dance, and that can explain what often goes on. So, a little more about that. Somebody who is avoidant is often in need of more self soothing. So, they need to sort of refill their tank with time to themselves where they don't have a lot of sensory input, or they do better just sort of calming themselves, and they can more easily feel overwhelmed by somebody needing things from them. And the more anxious person might look to their partner to calm, to get calm. And so that can stress out their avoidant partner and cause them to go further in the other direction, which then can make the anxious person even more anxious. So that's how this dynamic can play out. It can be very hurtful to both when someone who's anxious is, causing discomfort in the more reserved person and causes them to go further away because they want to try to calm themselves down, so that the anxious person may be getting critical or getting louder or sort of overwhelming the more reserved person. And then commonly they will kind of just force their ability to have some alone time or have their space, which then ends up hurting the anxious person because they're trying to connect with the more reserved person or the more avoidant person. Now, there are good things to both sides. Somebody who is more avoidant tends to be better at just self-soothing and calming your own system down and has some of those skills. The more anxious person may need to work on that and do better at attending to their own anxiety. But they also, as the more anxious person, tend to have more secure traits. So if it weren't for that person reaching out through the middle to pull their reserved partner in, the relationship can fall apart. And so the avoidant person can really learn from that and appreciate that secure tendency. So both sides really have something to learn from the other, and a lot can be gained from understanding that dynamic just in itself. And so nobody is necessarily absolutely, in on one side or the other. Some people very much are. Some people flip flop. It can go different ways. You can even find yourself on a different part of the spectrum depending on who you're with, as far as when you're dating or different relationships you've had. But whatever you tend to be in as far as a dynamic right now is what, of course, to pay attention to. Hopefully this helps you understand what's happening a little more. Depersonalize it a little because it's very common. That doesn't mean it isn't hurtful. That doesn't excuse it. But when you know better, you can do better. So that's the idea, is to recognize these tendencies in yourself. And what I think of is underneath these are needs, right? If the anxious person tends to get maybe a little more critical or louder so that they can be heard, there may be an underlying need to have attention, even if it's negative attention. And the avoidant person may need some more time to take care of themselves and calm their system and present. Ultimately, they often really want to present their best self to the relationship. And when they get overwhelmed by some of the intensity from their partner, they can tend to move further away. But to recognize that that's what they need, ask for what they need, and put kind of a timeline on the amount of time they need and when they can return to meet the needs that their partner legitimately has. So ultimately, part of being a grown-up is knowing how to ask for what you need, but first you have to know what it is that you need. And so there's very valid needs that we all have as humans and from each other. It's very common to feel like you're in this never-ending sort of dance of closeness and distance, and let's get closer, and now this feels a little too close, and let's get a little further away, and that feels a little too far away. And so that is just sort of the process of relationships and connectedness, but having this understanding and compassion for each other in where you're at in this way is kind of the starting point here. So the last dynamic I'm going to talk about is these four horsemen. And this really links up closely to that last slide, which I'll refer back to, because these are the four things that can end relationships. They are four communication patterns. And the worst of them is contempt. So criticism is, of course, when someone is, being critical about about their partner, and maybe kind of picking on them about something, or ridiculing, whatever that is. And contempt is really like a looking down on your partner. It's really a disrespect. It's eye rolling, and it's the worst one. It can mean that the relationship is almost over. And so if any of that is happening, it's important to just really immediately stop that. And I'll talk to you about what kind of the antidote is to that. Defensiveness is really about perceiving an attack, imagining that you are sort of a victim, and then pushing the person away, maybe lashing out in response, or deflecting, or putting up a wall somehow. And this is a really common one. It tends to be more common with those who are reserved or avoidant. And those who are more reactive and anxious tend to be more critical. And so the criticism can cue that defensiveness. And then stonewalling can happen as well by those who are more reserved or avoidant. Stonewalling is like leaving, shutting down a conversation, just walking out with no sign of when you're going to return to this topic, pick it back up, if ever. And that's really damaging too. It's not that it's all bad, because knowing that you're overwhelmed and wanting to take a break from a conversation is a healthy thing. And learning to have that as part of a practice when you have conflict going on is a good thing, because if you can say, hey, I'm just realizing I'm not at my best right now. I need 20 minutes or 2 hours to calm my system down a little bit, and then I'd love to kind of redo this conversation when we're both at our best. That's just kind and respectful, and it's good self-awareness. So stonewalling, though, doesn't give you that timeline of when you're going to come back to it. It isn't as respectful. It isn't so much about self-awareness. It's just sort of shutting someone down, ending the conversation, to selfishly just take care of yourself. And then it tends to make somebody who's more anxious much more anxious. And the thing to be aware of is, for somebody who tends to be anxious, if you stonewall too much, they can end up shutting down and detaching, and this can then make the more reserved or avoidant person very anxious and start reaching out, but it can be too late. So this is important to get this figured out and shored up as soon as possible, because you don't want the anxious or reactive person to disengage, because sometimes you can't get that trust built back. So to give them the benefit of the doubt, understand they really are trying to make a connection, because they fear that that connection is being lost, or it's insecure, they can't really count on you, is what's at the heart of that behavior. That does not make the criticism okay. Contempt is never okay as well. And so I want you to know what the opposites of those are. So the antidotes. The antidote to criticism is using I statements. Instead of saying, you never help with X, Y, and Z, you can say, I loved that you took care of whatever, whatever, whatever. I realized that you're tired and you could have spent your time some other way, but it meant so much to me that you did that, right? That would be best case, is point out a positive, reinforcing a positive. Not quite as good, but still better than finger pointing and criticism is, I would love if you could X, Y, and Z, or I feel dismissed when you leave a conversation and shut the door and don't ever pick it back up again. Using I statements is just owning your own feelings instead of pointing fingers. The antidote to contempt is appreciation. So build a culture of appreciation in your relationship. Make sure that you routinely thank each other for things that you might otherwise be seemingly taking for granted. The opposite of defensiveness is be accountable. Just be accountable to your own stuff, your own, even if it's a minor piece of truth within what your partner is saying, be accountable to that. It can really quickly calm a situation down, and that word, de-escalate things, to be like, I do agree that this piece of what you mentioned is true. I did do that. I'm sorry I did that. And I'll talk about how to make a really solid apology. And then the antidote to stonewalling is practice self-soothing. So to start a conversation, and even during a conversation, be able to keep your system calm and be at your best. Take care of yourself prior to getting into the situation so that you're not running already at capacity, and then it's sure to not go well. All of those things. Be aware of and take care of yourself in that way. And then if you do get to the point where you're overwhelmed, you need to step back, ask for what you need, make the request in light of how you care about the relationship, and you don't want to keep going in the wrong direction. You want to present yourself as best as you can. So this is the last self-reflection we'll do. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Write down for yourself, which of the 4 horsemen do you tend to engage in most? Criticism, contempt, defensiveness, or stonewalling. Number 2 is, what are your needs that are behind your use of those tactics? If you tend to be critical, do you need more connection? Do you need more physical touch? Do you need to be listened to better? If you tend to stonewall, do you need more time to refill your fuel tank, whatever that is? And then the third thing here is, which of these needs can I tend to for myself? Like, how much of this can you take care of yourself? And then what do you really truly need your partner for? If time is limited, but you want it to be quality, how can you ask for what you need and have your time together be of the highest quality? Then share your responses with each other, and I will tell you when the 2-minute mark is, that we have 2 minutes left, and then when we hit the 5 minutes. All right, we have about 2 minutes left. All right, we'll come back together here in just a few seconds. If you can wrap up your conversation, star it if you're not done. All right, so I hope that this one, the others have helped you start to think about your own role that you play in your relationship. It takes two people to be in this stance of a relationship. And if you are unhappy with the dynamic, you absolutely need to own your portion of it. There is no relationship in the world that is completely one-sided. And if you want to make progress, you definitely need to know your own part. It may not be equal, maybe bigger, maybe smaller, but regardless, there is a share that you own. And so this is why we can assist our clients in a strained relationship by working with them individually sometimes, because even if their partner isn't willing to work on the relationship together, um, you can work on your portion of it because you make up 50% of the relationship. So you alone could potentially improve a relationship by 50%. And so it's just obviously you can see my emphasis on kind of owning your own stuff and starting there. So I hope that's been helpful. I want you to make note of the 5 love languages and to plan to go to this website. It's 5lovelanguages.com and run through the quiz. If you don't already know what yours are, the 5 languages are listed here. You should know what your top 2 are and what your last one is, and then the same thing for your partner. So like I said, everything is either a deposit or a withdrawal. You want to make the most of your deposits. So if your number 1 is physical touch, but it's something your partner doesn't care for, your partner really needs to find a way to provide it sometimes. Just like if your partner really needs words of affirmation, but you're no good at that, you've got to figure it out. You need to learn how. And so that's something that you can do for each other in a way to find some common ground and meet in the middle. Because why deposit a penny when you can deposit $100 bill in your bank account? So if your partner doesn't care about gift giving, but loves acts of service, you know where to put your time and energy to be effective. And then for them to recognize, and you for your partner to recognize that they're doing that for you because it speaks to you in that way. So this can help you be efficient. Quality time is one that commonly females need and appreciate. It often boils down to your active listening skills, which is so much harder to apply at home in your personal life. And so you can really build trust with your partner this way, though, by using these skills. And this goes both ways, of course. So making sure that you both provide this opportunity to really understand your partner, or to listen to them, I mean, and for them to feel understood. I'd like you to write down, if you haven't, well, just watch it. Even if you have, watch it again. You can Google the title, It's Not About the Nail. Just a really quick video, which you can play on your own time. And it's meant to bring some humor into the situation. But it speaks to that idea of, don't feel like you need to jump to a conclusion and fix the scenario. It's truly about listening and understanding. I'm going to talk here about repair attempts, because sometimes what I mentioned earlier is that if you're trying to make deposits but they seem to be falling out the bottom of the piggy bank, it might be because there's a repair that needs to be made. You may not have said that you're sorry, or may not have provided a really solid apology that's stuck. And so there's 3 parts to a really solid apology. The first one is acknowledging that what you did hurt them and that you understand why it hurt them. So I can see why what I did hurt you, and repeating what it is that you said or did. Saying that I'm sorry that I did that. I never meant for you to be hurt. I'm so sorry that you were. I can see how and why you were. And here's what I want to do to make sure that that doesn't happen again. That is kind of the components of a really solid apology. And to think through those different aspects, write them down, those 3 different parts, and tailor that to the situation and to what you've gathered about how you understand your partner is hurt, can really be healing. It can take a little time to sink in. Give it time. Don't expect an immediate result. But you can use this, and it's often what will help kind of shore up the leaky piggy bank. If you've gotten off track in your relationship, these are some ideas. Put away your phones during mealtime. Really tune into each other. Show affection. It is something that sometimes is missing. Sometimes it's withheld. Sometimes there's a bit of game playing with it. Sometimes it just isn't what one person prefers, or they need to feel emotionally connected first. Whatever that is, talk through what's going on there and start to work towards some common ground with that. Because ultimately, you have this one person to be affectionate with, and it's healthy and good for you to have that connection with each other, and that type of connectedness. Schedule a weekly date, or at least monthly. If you have young kids, weekly might be really hard to do depending on your schedules. Allow for redos. If you're having a conversation that isn't going well, give each other permission to say, hold on, I just realized we're off track. I want to protect us. Let's pick this up later and have a redo. And that is a great way to just agree to kind of clear the slate and start fresh when you're in a better spot. And you can do it again and again and again until you get really good at practicing how you communicate, and doing so with I statements and without criticism and without defensiveness, and really being accountable to your own stuff, and then making sure your systems stay very calm while you're communicating. You can start writing down memories and experiences that you have together, so you can look back on that. In your lives, there are often plenty of challenging experiences, plenty at work for a law enforcement officer. You really need to balance that out with lots of good stuff on the other side of that scale. And so build in those really positive memories and experiences with your partner to help balance out life. You can dream together, reminisce together, make plans together. What are you in this together for? And then schedule the next time that you're going to talk about what we covered here. This was a huge amount of information, and take just a minute right now to decide, are you going to do that? Is there probably 2 hours you can carve out to actually schedule into your calendar a time to come back to some of these topics, because you'll sleep on it, you'll think on it on your own. You might take some more notes, fill in more on that piece of paper you've been writing on, and then circle back to each other to connect more on this. These are some ideas of what you can just say during conflict, some helpful phrases that the Gottman Institute recommends for just asking for what you need. I need to take a break. Can I try saying that again? I don't know how to say this any better, but I want to. I know it isn't your fault. Here's how I'm feeling. Thank you for understanding. Can I take back what I said? That isn't what I meant. Any of these things. I messed up. I can see my part in this. All of these things are super healthy to be able to say. I understand. I love you. I'm sorry. These should be like regular parts of your vocabulary. All right, so a last couple things here. Think about being someone who you would want to be married to. And that's maybe a way you haven't thought about it before, but would you give yourself a perfect score if you were to think about how ideal of a partner you are? And I doubt that any of us would give ourselves a 10. And so what keeps you from being at a 10? And start there. It's not all on your partner. I'm saying that, of course, to both of you. It isn't all on your partner. So start with yourself first. You can't control anybody else, but start with yourself first. And if you're both doing that, you're going to have an incredibly strong relationship. You can only get so far if you're only working on yourself. You can't get very far at all if you're only focused on changing your partner. But if you both are focused on yourself, you're going to do the best. The opposite of judgmental is curious. So instead of being critical, be curious. Try to give the benefit of the doubt. If your feelings are hurt, try to express that and express why. And then in return, instead of getting defensive, try to say, I'm so sorry that what I said landed like that. That isn't what I meant. I can see how that happened. And I'm going to be mindful about that so that I don't phrase it that way or do that way again. Ask for what you need. It's a super grown-up thing to do. Invest in figuring out how you might be wired differently from your spouse. It isn't better or worse the way that you are wired or the way you tend to operate, but if you don't understand each other or yourself, it can of course lead to hurtful consequences. Get really good at that agility, be able to switch out of work mode and into home mode, and to go back and forth with more grace. Use humor, accept it, laugh at each other's jokes, give each other looks and smiles, and build that warmth in your connection. And then set rules about conflict. If for one of you it's so hurtful if the other walks away, take that off the table. Don't have that be an option. Find a way to solve that problem by having an alternative. No name calling, no threats of divorce. Some of these things maybe you already definitely do, but open, calm, meaningful conversation where you say what you mean and you mean what you say is much healthier. These are some more ideas here. And the last one, which I want to point out, is go to therapy as a couple if either one of you wants the help. You don't both have to agree on that. You really need to go if either one of you wants that kind of help. And then let the therapist determine or help you determine the timing. Do you both need individual and couples? Like, how can that work? I just want you to be most effective and efficient in getting where you need to be. And if things are generally going really well and you're just trying to strengthen your connection, you can use couples therapy as a way to kind of tune things up too, or have a good resource that you know and trust in case things do get rough. All right, so I told you I was going to leave some time for questions, so I'll do that now. I'm going to stop the recording.